What happens when the might of the world turns against the house of God? When a nation built on faith and covenant faces the hammer of an empire that worships nothing but power, what becomes of hope? Could the shadow of Rome's legions, stamping across Jerusalem, foretell the storms that small nations face today, trembling under the march of modern superpowers? The morning sun rose over Jerusalem, but its light did little to chase away the dread that filled the city. Dust swirled in the streets like restless spirits, carrying with it the cries of women and children, the clash of swords, and the relentless drumbeat of Roman boots. The city's walls, once proud and sacred, quivered under the assault of battering rams, and gates meant to protect now splintered, as if mocking the faith of those within. Every stone seemed to whisper a warning, every shadow cast by the flickering sun, a premonition of doom. Inside the temple, the priests moved with hurried reverence. Their hands shook as they tended the sacred vessels, brushed the dust from golden altars, and lifted their eyes toward a heaven that seemed silent. The golden menorah flickered, throwing dancing shadows across ancient walls, as though the spirits of prophets past, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, stirred to witness the unfolding calamity. Murmured prayers escaped trembling lips, fragments of covenant and warning, reminders of promises made, yet also of judgment long foretold. Outside, the Roman legion advanced like a tide of iron and fire. Standards gleamed in the morning light, shields rang with unholy precision, and the air trembled with the shout of thousands bound by discipline and ambition. Flames began to leap from the outer walls, consuming wood, parchment, and hope alike. The sound of breaking gates and cracking stones echoed like thunder through the valleys, while smoke coiled into the sky, a dark column that carried the cries of a people whose faith had not faltered, yet whose city was on the brink of annihilation. It was more than destruction of stone and gold. It was the crushing of a covenant, the silencing of a sacred voice, the bending of a people under the weight of worldly power. And yet, even as fire consumed the temple, the invisible hand of God moved through the ruins, shaping destinies unseen and weaving a warning that would resonate across millennia. For the fall of Jerusalem was not only an event of its time, it was a message, a prophetic echo to nations yet unborn, to small peoples facing empires that bow to nothing but might. As the smoke climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of crimson and ash, the question remained: who will listen to the warnings of history? Who will see in the roar of advancing legions a mirror of the present, where modern powers crush smaller nations and faith trembles under the weight of steel, politics, and ambition? This is not just history. It is prophecy speaking across the ages. The destruction of the temple by Rome is more than an ancient tragedy. It is a cautionary vision for our time. Nations may rise, empires may crush, yet the hand of God moves invisibly, weaving judgment and hope, warning and promise. The walls may fall, the fires may rage, but the story continues, and its echoes are visible today in the trembling hearts of those who dare to stand against overwhelming power. Long before the legions of Rome ever darkened the hills of Jerusalem, the story of a people chosen by God began in the dust of the desert, where the winds whispered covenant and destiny. Abraham, a man called from Ur of the Chaldeans, lifted his eyes toward the stars, counting them, as if measuring the eternity of God's promise. "Your descendants shall be as the stars of heaven," the voice had said. And in that promise lay the seed of a nation, fragile yet eternal, small yet destined to shape the course of history. Through Isaac and Jacob, the covenant threaded itself like a river of blood and faith, carving a lineage that would endure trials, wanderings, and betrayals. Jacob wrestled through the night, grappling with God himself, and emerged with a name, Israel, a name that would echo through centuries as both a blessing and a target of envy. His sons spread across the land, dividing bloodlines, yet uniting under the invisible hand of providence. Joseph's dreams and the envy of his brothers carried them into Egypt, where the people of God would flourish and suffer under foreign rule, setting the stage for a drama that would touch the heavens. The Exodus was not merely a flight from Pharaoh's hand. It was a declaration that history itself could be shaped by the unseen power of God. The Red Sea rolled back as if the earth itself obeyed the command of the Almighty, and the people passed on dry ground, leaving behind an empire's arrogance and a warning etched in the waters. Mount Sinai burned with fire and cloud. And there God gave a law, not only for a nation, but for the moral compass of the world. Stone tablets carved with divine decree would carry the covenant through generations. Love, justice, mercy, and the promise that God's hand would not abandon his own, even when they faltered. Time flowed like a river, and Israel settled in the land promised to Abraham, conquering cities, claiming hills, and establishing a kingdom that pulsed with the heart of God. David, shepherd and king, captured Jerusalem, making it not only a city of stone, but a city of destiny. Solomon, his son, built the temple, a house of gold and incense, a dwelling place for the glory of the Almighty. It was a beacon to the nations, a visible proof that God's covenant was living, breathing, and unshakable. Yet even as the temple rose, so too did the shadows of human ambition, envy, and rebellion, reminders that the covenant was not a shield from the world's storms, but a lamp to guide the faithful through them. Prophets rose to speak truth to kings, their voices cutting like swords through the fog of complacency. Isaiah warned of judgment for those who turned from God. Jeremiah wept over a city soon to fall, and Ezekiel painted visions of destruction and hope intertwined. Each prophet carried a mirror of the human soul, reflecting both the promise and peril of covenant obedience. Their words were not merely for Israel. They were warnings inscribed in history, echoing across generations. Nations rise, empires fall, but God's plan endures, and his people are both witness and participant. Through exile and return, conquest and liberation, Israel's story was shaped by the tension between human ambition and divine providence. The bloodlines of Abraham endured, scattered across lands, yet rooted in the covenant. Each generation learned the fragile balance of faith and survival, of obedience and defiance, of devotion and recklessness. From the sands of Sinai to the stones of Jerusalem, the sacred chronicle unfolded. Each chapter, a testament to the power of God to use a small, chosen people to influence the course of history itself. Even as the temple shone under Solomon's hand, and even as kings and prophets walked the streets of Jerusalem, the stage for greater trials was being set. Rome, distant yet looming, would one day cast its shadow across these hills. Yet the covenant, forged in blood and faith, whispered across the ages. No empire, no army, no temporal power could erase the promise of God. The roots of Israel's story were deep and unyielding, a warning and a beacon for those who would come after. proof that even the smallest of nations, anchored in divine covenant, could endure storms, survive sieges, and leave an indelible mark upon the world. The ancient origins of Israel were not merely history. They were prophecy written in flesh and stone, a foundation for the tragedies and triumphs yet to unfold, and a reminder that God's plan, however hidden, is never absent. Long before the legions of Rome encircled Jerusalem, Israel had faced its first prophetic clash, a confrontation that was more than armies meeting on the field. It was a collision of destinies, of nations, and of divine will against human ambition. The Canaanites, Amalekites, and Philistines stood like shadows against the light of God's chosen. Their swords and spears a test of faith, their triumphs and defeats a message written by the hand of the Almighty. The battlefields of Joshua's campaigns were alive with fire and fear. Jericho's walls, once formidable and unyielding, crumbled not by siege engines, but by obedience, by the sound of trumpets and the whispered power of faith. Could human armies have succeeded alone? Certainly not. God's presence moved like wind and earthquake through the ranks of the faithful, shaping victory from devotion and courage. And yet, for those who doubted, defeat awaited, reminders that the spiritual weight of covenant was more potent than the mightiest sword. David's confrontation with Goliath became a symbol for ages to come. A shepherd boy, armed with nothing but a sling and a steadfast heart, defying the might of a seasoned warrior. The clash was not merely physical. It was spiritual, a battle between belief and arrogance, between the small and the mighty. Every stone hurled from David's hand carried more than momentum. It carried the authority of God and the weight of prophecy. When Goliath fell, it was more than a victory of flesh over flesh. It was the first echo of a truth that would resonate when empires like Rome marched upon God's city. The seemingly weak, when aligned with the divine, can withstand forces that crush nations. The prophets stood beside these confrontations, their voices a sword and shield of words, Samuel's warnings, Isaiah's visions, and Jeremiah's laments pierced the hearts of kings and soldiers alike, revealing that no victory in war could substitute for righteousness in the eyes of God. When Israel triumphed, it was obedience that carried them. When they fell, it was pride and disobedience that sealed their fate. These confrontations were never merely political. They were prophetic, each battle a mirror of the eternal struggle between God's will and human ambition. Even the nations that seemed invincible bore the mark of God's warning. The Philistines, for all their strength and armor, could not escape the shaping hand of divine purpose. Amalek's hostility was not random. It was a test, a warning that enmity against God's people carries consequences that echo through generations. In every clash, there was a lesson. The forces of might may appear dominant, but the God of Israel orchestrates history in ways the human eye cannot perceive. These early prophetic clashes set the stage for what would come centuries later: the rise of empires, the siege of Jerusalem, and the destruction of the temple. Each encounter, each war, was a rehearsal for the day when the world's power would gather in Rome, intent on crushing a small nation, just as modern superpowers test the resolve of the faithful today. The lessons of Joshua, David, and the prophets were clear. Faith, obedience, and divine alignment outweigh numbers, weapons, and ambition. And yet, even with God on their side, the people were not exempt from suffering, an enduring warning for those who live in the shadow of global giants. for whom courage must meet oppression, and faith must confront fear. The first prophetic clash was never merely an ancient skirmish. It was the first stanza of a long divine symphony of conflict between the eternal God and the kingdoms of man. And in the echo of these battles, the faithful are reminded, history repeats not as mere chronology, but as prophecy, each clash a whisper of the storms that will test nations, small and great alike. Empires rise like tempests, unstoppable and consuming, leaving the weak trembling in their wake. Babylon stretched its hand across the fertile crescent, golden and cruel, its king asserting dominion, as if the heavens themselves had ordained it. The mighty walls of Nineveh rose in Assyria, their shadow falling across the valleys of Israel, a chilling reminder that power often comes without conscience. Persia swept through lands with calculated precision, its kings wearing crowns heavy with ambition. And yet, through every conquest, every siege, every declaration of might, the visions of Daniel and the warnings of Ezekiel whispered a truth that empires could not silence. These kingdoms, grand and fearsome, were instruments in the hand of God, moving history according to a purpose far beyond human understanding. Daniel, carried into Babylon as a youth, watched kings tremble before visions and dreams that none but God could reveal. Nebuchadnezzar saw a statue, brilliant and towering, yet crumbling beneath the weight of destiny, and learned that the kingdoms of men, no matter how resplendent, are temporary against the eternal throne of the Almighty. Ezekiel, carried to the river Chebar, beheld the glory of God departing Jerusalem, a stark warning that pride, disobedience, and the turning of hearts from the covenant would invite the instruments of judgment. These prophets saw clearly what human rulers could not. Empires may rise to glory, but they rise as part of a divine narrative, their victories and defeats foretold, their hubris marked for eventual humbling. Egypt, long a cradle of civilization, played its part in this symphony of empires, its pharaohs boasting walls and armies, pyramids and riches. Yet even the Nile could not preserve arrogance from the currents of destiny. Persia's rise brought order, but also the bitter taste of exile, as Jews were carried from Jerusalem to Babylon, their temple desecrated, their covenant tested, and Rome, patient and inexorable, would one day stretch its legions across the Mediterranean, its eagles casting shadow upon the Temple Mount, its legions poised to fulfill what prophecy had long whispered, that no earthly fortress could withstand the sweep of divine judgment when humanity turned from its God. These empires were instruments, yes, but they were instruments with teeth. For the people of Israel, the rise of empires was never merely a story of conquest. It was a test of faith, a stage where obedience and rebellion collided with devastating effect. Babylon demanded tribute and submission. Assyria demanded loyalty and fear. Persia offered tolerance, but tested allegiance. Rome would offer civilization and order, yet crush resistance with the iron fist of history. In each case, the nations that rose against God's people were not random. They were signs, warnings carved into the chronicles of time, echoing the principle that God uses the proud to shape his purposes, often in ways that confound the human mind. The prophets framed these empires not merely as historical forces, but as symbols of spiritual realities. Pride, cruelty, ambition, and arrogance, the hallmarks of human power, were always contrasted against the enduring covenant, the invisible hand guiding those who remained faithful. History repeated in patterns: rise, conquest, hubris, and eventual fall. Daniel's visions of beasts and kingdoms foretold the cyclical rise and fall of empires, each with its peculiar terror, each with its role in God's plan. Ezekiel's lamentations reminded Israel that destruction is never arbitrary. It is a message, a mirror reflecting the choices of men and nations, and a warning to those who would forget God in the pursuit of dominion. As Rome expanded, absorbing Greece, Carthage, and all rivals, the pattern became unmistakable. Power without godly restraint brings calamity, yet power used as an instrument of God can fulfill prophecy in ways beyond comprehension. Were these empires merely tools in God's hand, wielded to test, refine, and sometimes punish? The answer echoes through every generation. Yes. And in their rise, Israel and all nations who witness these patterns are reminded that history is never chaos. It is a carefully arranged drama, and empires, no matter how mighty, are actors on a stage commanded by the eternal director. The rise of empires, dazzling and terrifying, sets the scene for Rome's ultimate confrontation with Jerusalem, for the hammer that would fall upon the temple, and for the enduring lesson that human might is never the final word. From Babylon to Rome, the message is clear. Empires may dominate the earth, but they serve a purpose far greater than their ambitions, a purpose that no throne, no legion, and no crown can thwart. The prophets spoke with a voice that cut through time, their words ringing like trumpets over generations. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, each lifted a warning not merely to kings, but to all who would turn from the covenant, all who would trust in walls, armies, and fleeting alliances instead of the God who holds the heavens and the nations in his hand. Their warnings were not idle threats. They were divine proclamations, visions carved into the fabric of history, meant to awaken the hearts of men before the hammer of judgment fell. Jeremiah's lament over Jerusalem trembles with urgency. The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. Jeremiah 8:20. The words are sharp as a sword, a reminder that time runs swift for those who ignore God's call. Israel, though chosen and beloved, was not immune to destruction when the covenant was forgotten. The siege that Rome would later bring was foretold in such laments, a shadow over the city that no earthly weapon could fully describe, a shadow that serves as a warning to all nations that trust in power over righteousness. Ezekiel's visions pierced even further, painting the fall of Jerusalem in living color. The glory of God departing the temple was a signal that spiritual corruption invites material ruin. Ezekiel 9 records the mark placed upon the righteous, the faithful who would be spared the coming destruction, while judgment fell on the disobedient. The message is clear. God's hand moves beyond armies and empires. He moves in justice, separating the faithful from those who reject his ways. Prophecy is not merely observation. It is warning, a divine tremor that shakes nations before calamity arrives. Daniel's revelations in Babylon reveal the same unyielding truth. Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the colossal statue, a head of gold, chest of silver, thighs of bronze, legs of iron, was no idle vision. Each kingdom, each empire, represented in fragile human terms, would rise and fall according to God's design. Daniel's warnings were a reminder that even the mightiest nations, those that appear invincible, operate within the boundaries of divine sovereignty. Rome, the iron leg that would crush Jerusalem, was foretold in the pattern of these visions, a warning echoing down the centuries. No human power escapes God's decree. These prophetic warnings were not just about the distant past. They resonate across time. The destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the scattering of Israel, the exile of a people. These were the fulfillment of words spoken centuries before. Yet prophecy is more than history. It is instruction, a mirror held up to the present. Just as Israel faced the might of Rome, small nations today tremble under the shadow of modern superpowers. The warnings of Isaiah and Jeremiah remind us that relying solely on military strength, treaties, or wealth is folly if hearts are turned away from the living God. Prophecy is vivid, stark, and relentless. It warns of famine, war, exile, and the collapse of cities. Yet, within the warnings, there is mercy, a path of repentance, obedience, and trust that can avert or mitigate judgment. The faithful are marked, preserved, and guided, while the proud and unrepentant are left to the consequences of their choices. Could these words be unfolding in our own time? The echoes are undeniable. History repeats, patterns persist, and the same divine scrutiny that fell on ancient Jerusalem watches the nations of today. The prophetic warnings are unrelenting. Empires rise, armies march, cities burn, but the hand of God orchestrates all, and those who heed the call may yet stand while others fall. They serve as a bridge between ancient devastation and contemporary caution, a voice that transcends time, calling all nations, all leaders, and all hearts to remember the covenant, to honor the Almighty, and to recognize that power without God is a path to ruin. The pages of Scripture tremble with warnings that echo across centuries. Yet, the modern world often moves as if history were a forgotten tale. Jerusalem, once crushed under the iron legions of Rome, now stands at the center of a tension that spans continents. Small nations, caught between the ambitions of larger powers, remember in their bones the lessons of the past. Empires rise and fall, but the consequences of pride and disregard for God's sovereignty remain eternal. Could it be that the shadows of Rome's legions are mirrored in the drones circling over modern capitals, in missile silos, in the whispered threats of nuclear arsenals? Israel, the land chosen and tested, finds itself at the crossroads of prophecy and politics. Centuries after the temple fell, Jerusalem remains a flashpoint, its stones and streets carrying the weight of covenant, exile, and revival. Around it, nations maneuver, some seeking dominance, others seeking survival. Iran's rhetoric against the Jewish state recalls the ancient threats from empires that surrounded Jerusalem, their ambitions unchecked, their power swelling. The prophetic warnings are alive, as if the words of Ezekiel and Daniel were not distant history, but instructions etched in stone for modern ears. Beware the pride of nations. No fortress can withstand divine will. Across the globe, the ambitions of Russia, China, and other modern superpowers echo the rise of Babylon, Assyria, and Persia. The lessons of empire remain unlearned. Expansion without justice, alliances without righteousness, and ambition without humility inevitably court judgment. Small nations caught in these crossfires are reminded of Israel's ancient plight. They tremble not only at the might of armies, but at the moral and spiritual weight of history. The realization that nations who forget God or rely solely on their own strength often pay a price far greater than anticipated. The Middle East, a tinderbox of religion, politics, and history, mirrors the prophetic cycles. Ancient enmities, old alliances, and the scars of centuries-old battles linger, shaping every decision, every conflict. As leaders meet behind closed doors, the echoes of Isaiah and Jeremiah whisper warnings. Power is fleeting, and the consequences of arrogance extend far beyond the battlefield. Jerusalem's survival through millennia of threat is not a coincidence. It is testimony to a divine plan that transcends human calculation. Small nations today can take heed or repeat the errors of history. Technology has magnified the stakes. Missiles can strike cities in moments. Cyber warfare can cripple economies. And propaganda can inflame hatred across continents. Yet, despite all the tools of modern might, the prophetic lesson is unchanged. Human power, no matter how sophisticated, cannot escape divine oversight. Just as Rome's legions crushed the temple and scattered a people, modern superpowers can dominate territories, but they cannot erase destiny or the covenantal promises that withstand time. The echoes of history are loud, warning that even the most formidable armadas and arsenals serve only as instruments when measured against the will of God. Even diplomacy, the art of alliances, bears the mark of prophecy. Treaties can be broken, agreements can falter, and loyalty can shift like desert sands. Isaiah 8 warns of those who trust in human counsel instead of divine guidance, promising that human schemes crumble when unmoored from God's purpose. The modern world, with its United Nations, summits, and international accords, still dances to a rhythm set long ago. Justice, humility, and obedience are eternal currencies, far more enduring than gold, armies, or territory. And yet, hope endures. Just as the faithful were preserved amid Rome's destruction, nations and peoples today can survive if they anchor themselves in wisdom and righteousness. Israel's resurgence in the 20th century, the preservation of faith, culture, and identity against centuries of dispersion, demonstrates that prophecy is not only a warning, it is a guide to perseverance. Modern small nations, while vulnerable, can find strength in the lessons of history, courage under threat, faith amidst chaos, and adherence to divine principles, even when human power seems insurmountable. The parallels are stark. Rome's legions are mirrored in modern armies. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE resonates in the geopolitical earthquakes shaking small nations today. The patterns repeat. Ambition rises unchecked. The proud wield power. The weak tremble. And God's sovereign hand watches. Are we witnessing the unfolding of prophecy in our lifetimes? Are the tremors of ancient warnings now shaking the foundations of contemporary politics? The answer is not hidden in newspapers or satellite imagery, but in the quiet recognition that history, when read through the lens of Scripture, is never silent. We live in an age where empires still rise, where small nations face threats far beyond their control, and where the faithful must navigate the storm with eyes open to both the seen and unseen. The warnings of the prophets are alive, urging vigilance, humility, and faith. They remind us that while power may seem absolute, history bends under divine purpose. The story of Jerusalem's fall, the scattering of Israel, and the rise of empires is not merely an echo of the past. It is a mirror to the present, a message to small nations, and a call to recognize that in God's plan, no force of men can ever claim final victory. Beneath the clashing armies, beneath the clamor of diplomacy and the roar of modern weapons, lies a battle invisible to the eyes of men. Ephesians 6-12 warns that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. The legions that marched on Jerusalem were but instruments. The true conflict transcended stone, blood, and empire. The same unseen struggle rages today, where nations rise and fall not only by strategy, but by forces beyond human comprehension. The spiritual battlefield is a place where pride, greed, and hatred are sharpened into weapons, and where fear can infect the hearts of entire peoples. Rome's triumph over the temple was a physical manifestation of a deeper spiritual rebellion, a world enthralled to power and ambition, blind to divine authority. The desecration of sacred space was more than political conquest. It was a declaration that man's will, unanchored from God, can devastate what is holy. And yet, even then, the unseen hand of providence was at work, guiding the faithful, preserving hope, and sowing the seeds of resurrection that would flourish centuries later. Today, the same spiritual dynamics unfold. Modern superpowers, alliances, and global conflicts are more than human disputes. They are reflections of cosmic opposition. Leaders may believe they act alone, that their plans are self-made, but every move resonates in realms beyond sight. The struggles of Israel, the trembling of small nations, the moral and ethical dilemmas confronting the world, all are arenas where the battle of principalities and powers manifest. The air is thick with the unseen currents of influence, where righteousness and deception collide in ways that shape history. Faith becomes the armor of the soldier who cannot see the enemy. Prayer, integrity, and courage are the swords, wielded against forces that no army can vanquish. Jerusalem's survival through millennia of siege and threat is testimony to this higher battle. The people who endured the legions of Rome, who survived exile, persecution, and dispersion, were preserved not merely by human fortitude, but by alignment with God's will. Spiritual vigilance transforms weakness into resilience, fear into clarity, and apparent defeat into a prelude to victory. In this war, every choice matters. Nations that ignore spiritual realities invite calamity. Societies that trust solely in military might or political cunning court destruction. The prophets of old warned not only of armies, but of the hearts of men, the corruption of power, and the temptation to forsake righteousness for convenience. Today, the faithful must discern the hidden currents shaping the world, recognizing that behind every headline, every missile, every treaty, lies a spiritual dimension influencing outcomes. The spiritual battle is relentless, yet hope endures. Just as Rome could not extinguish God's covenant with his people, no force of darkness can overturn the divine plan. The challenge for nations and individuals alike is to awaken to the unseen struggle, to equip themselves with truth and faith, and to act as vessels of righteousness in a world swayed by ambition, deception, and fear. History, scripture, and modern crises converge to reveal one immutable truth. The war we see is only a fragment of the war that truly matters, and victory belongs to those who understand both the visible and invisible realms. The sky darkens as the final chapters of history approach, and the world holds its breath. Armies amass, alliances tremble, and the ground quakes beneath the weight of human ambition. But these are only preludes. From the Mount of Olives, a king will rise, his eyes aflame with justice, his voice shattering the false confidence of kings and nations alike. The nations that have oppressed, deceived, and trampled the covenant people will see their power crumble as though it were dust in a storm. Jerusalem, scarred but unbroken, will witness a reckoning that surpasses all human understanding. The temple of old, destroyed by Rome, points to a greater fulfillment yet to come. A restoration not of brick and mortar alone, but of divine order and eternal purpose. Clouds of glory descend, the trumpet sounds, and every heart is revealed. The armies of the earth will clash, yet the true victory is not in swords or missiles. It is in the unveiling of God's eternal plan. The oppressed will rise, the faithful will rejoice, and the proud will be humbled. History, prophecy, and destiny converge, reminding the world that no force of man can overturn what heaven has decreed. The coming fulfillment is unstoppable, visible, and undeniable. From the shadow of Rome's legions to the tremors of today's global superpowers, the story of Jerusalem's fall and redemption echoes across time. History has shown that empires rise and crumble, yet God's covenant endures. The destruction of the temple was not merely an ancient tragedy, it was a warning, a lesson etched into the soul of nations. Power without righteousness invites ruin, and oppression never extinguishes the spirit of the faithful. We have traced the bloodlines of the patriarchs, witnessed the first prophetic clashes, and felt the weight of divine warnings that span millennia. We have seen the rise of empires, the spiritual battles behind the headlines, and the terrifying yet magnificent fulfillment that waits on the horizon. Every conflict, every trembling nation, every moral choice carries the imprint of a story far greater than human ambition. A story written by the author of destiny. The truth is clear. The battles we see are only the surface. The unseen war, the clash of principalities and powers, continues to shape the world. Faith, courage, and discernment are the shields and swords we wield in this cosmic struggle. Subscribe, like, share, and comment to help spread these revelations. Stand with the faithful, understand the signs, and prepare for the unfolding of God's plan. The next episode will journey deeper into the mysteries of prophecy, revealing how ancient warnings continue to speak into the crises of our own time. History is alive, prophecy is active, and the story is far from over.